Okay, so we're just going to dive right in. The first subtopic of today's lecture will be about human culture. So we're just going to talk a little bit about culture and how you might see it on the MCAT. So starting with the basics, what is culture? Well, culture is the shared beliefs, values, practices, and knowledge of a specific social group. I know throughout high school, I was always getting the definition that culture is the blueprints for a society. So it really is what makes a specific society that society. What is, what is important about it? What's interesting about it? And there are different types of culture. When we analyze culture, we can split it up into a bunch of different ways. So symbolic culture is the facet that is made up of symbols, and it's recognized by members of that culture. So it's not material. So symbolic culture can involve greetings, gestures, languages, rituals, anything like that. Like if you travel across the world, obviously a different country is going to greet, it's going to greet acquaintances differently than you would maybe in this country, or even within a specific culture, you're going to greet an acquaintance differently than you're going to greet a longtime friend or a parent or something like that. So it's the not material things that we do, the way we interact with each other, that makes up our symbolic culture. And opposed to that, we have material culture as well. That is the facet of culture that is made up of actual physical objects. So examples here, material culture is made up of food, clothing, hairstyles, and this is the most obvious form of culture, I think, that we think of. For example, when we travel on vacation, we say we like to soak in the culture. And what we usually mean by that is we like to travel, we look at the sites, we like to see the historic sites. We'll eat at restaurants there. Maybe we'll buy some clothes over there. So a lot of times, especially when we're talking, from an American viewpoint, when we talk about culture and consuming the culture of others, a lot of times we're talking about material culture, but it's very important to make that distinction. And then we have non-material culture, and that's just the beliefs and thought processes shared by a people or a social group. So when you change groups, if you're in America, you're going to have a different belief about certain things than if you go to Japan or if you go to the opposite side of the world. It's just the culture and the society that you grow up in. It forms our beliefs and our thoughts, and that's part of the non-material culture aspect. So within a society, culture may vary depending on factors such as class or race. And two further divisions of culture that we can analyze and look in real time are high culture and popular culture. So high culture, I'm sure we've heard of both of these, but high culture describes the parts of culture that are consumed by the elite to express their identity. So high culture are the fancy things, basically. So when we're thinking of the very elite or the very upper class, things that are fancy that they use to identify with their socioeconomic status. So when you think of someone rich in America, for example, you would think of, maybe they like to consume art. They'll go to art galas, or they'll spend a lot of time at the ballet, or they'll go to an opera, or they'll eat at very exclusive restaurants, very high-end restaurants. So that's all part of high culture because it's consumed by the elite and it helps them to express their identity. And similarly, we also have popular culture or pop culture, which describes the elements that appeal to the majority of a social group. And they're often communicated through social media and mass media like radio and television. And pop culture is something that all of us are familiar with. And like the definition says, it's consumed by the mass majority, by the majority of the population. So anybody that's on social media, anybody that watches TV, you're very much in tune to what's going on, even if it's not super important things, like something political or something that's going on with the weather, even if it's just the life of a celebrity or something, something like that maybe one person finds value in and another person doesn't. It's all part of pop culture because it's consumed by the masses. So while culture varies from group to group, there are also universals, and these are patterns and traits that are shared by all human beings. We've developed and grown for thousands of years, separate, isolated from each other. But there are universals that we share. There are not a lot of them, but they are. And it's usually pertaining to meeting basic needs. So like gathering food, if we're building shelter, manipulating water, bringing irrigation, bringing water, stuff like that are universals because those are things that it's part of human culture, that it's a uniting factor. We all need to do this stuff to survive. But everything else is really cultural aspects that develop specifically to a people's culture. So that's why cultural differences are actually much more common than cultural universals, which is interesting and definitely something to keep in mind. So beliefs and values. So our values and beliefs are some of the most crucial aspects of a culture. So they make up that non-material culture that we were speaking about before. They're very similar, values and beliefs, but there are some differences. They're connected, but they are different. So values are defined as a culture's standard for evaluating what is good or bad. This affects our behavior and our character. So an example is that some cultures may value monogamy over sexual promiscuity. I know very conservative or very religious cultures value monogamy over sexual promiscuity, and that would be considered a value. And we'll talk in a minute about how beliefs affect these values, but that would be that specific value. Some societies may use laws to enforce the values as well. So values are sort of like the ideal way that we want people to act, and it's not always the way that humans do act. So for example, in America, we have anti-discrimination laws. And that enforces the value of open-mindedness, because we are said to value diversity, open-mindedness, but that's not always the case. We have our prejudices, we have our biases. So we have anti-discrimination laws in America, and it among doing other things, it enforces this value of open-mindedness, and it discourages behaviors that are counter to it. And it discourages it by penalizing it. And beliefs are the convictions or principles held by people that affect which values they hold. So it's somewhat of a cause and effect relationship. They're definitely intertwined. So the belief that you hold will lead to a value. So a belief in Christianity may result in one's held value of monogamy, if that makes sense. So a lot of times beliefs are what's going on in our head, and then the values are the standards that we set, the way that we are supposed to act, the ideal way that we are supposed to act. And then we have norms. Those are just the rules of social conduct within a society. We talked a little bit before about greetings. I thought that was a pretty good example. Acquaintances in the United States meeting for the first time may shake hands as a greeting. That's not the case all over the world. Each society is going to have, a different norm of how to conduct themselves in a specific social situation. And that's part of the cultural differences from social group to social group. And sometimes, obviously, it makes for a breakdown in communication between two individuals from two different social groups. Okay, so subcultures and countercultures. These are also both similar. I see these get confused a lot of the times, but there are some pretty important differences between the two. So they're both smaller sections of a culture that have slightly different values, but they're a little bit different from each other. So a subculture is a smaller group of people within a culture who share slightly different values and beliefs than the masses. So the key there is that they share slightly different values. These groups normally hold values that are somewhat in line with those of the masses. So they're not standing completely at odds with the masses. They just have, their values are slightly different. And a lot of times it's marginalized communities that are trying to, integrate into mainstream and, establish boundaries and respect. So examples include bikers, bodybuilders, the LGBTQ plus community, anything like that. Those are considered subcultures. And you can look into them, and they actually do have their, they have their own ways of dressing, their own ways of speaking. So it's really interesting when you look individually into each of those. But those are the subcultures. They're not the important part. The important thing to understand about a subculture is that it's not standing at odds with the mass, as opposed to a counterculture. It is also a small group of people within a culture, but they are counter, like the name. They're standing at odds with the larger group's belief and values. So they are trying to change something usually. And they usually start as protests or attempts to change the society. And they're actually often eventually adopted into the society's mainstream culture. And a few examples of countercultures in America were the suffragettes, polygamists. You could even consider the abolitionists as counterculture. And a lot of times they're fighting against, they're protesting, and it does sort of it starts to become part of the mainstream culture, the counterculture. So subculture is sort of like an offshoot of culture. Counterculture is against it. So definitely keep those two in mind, and definitely make sure you understand the difference between the two. Okay, and a little bit about the spread of culture. So cultural diffusion is the transfer of elements of culture from one social group to another. So cultural diffusion often occurs voluntarily through contact of different cultures, but it can also be forced. For example, cultural imperialism. Um, I think there are a lot of people who will probably debate the use of the phrase cultural imperialism as a section of cultural diffusion. But I mean, if we consider it as a forced form of cultural diffusion, that kind of is what it is. The diffusion of culture has been accelerated in recent years due to the rise of mass media and global communication. So we'll talk a little bit about globalization as well later, but mass media, global communication, and technology within the last 100 years or so, from mostly the 20th and 21st century, have caused this huge exponential increase in globalization and the diffusion of culture all across the globe. I mean, if you walk down the street, regardless of what country you're in, if you walk down the street in specific areas, you can probably find restaurants in different places from all different countries. And cultural diffusion may lead to cultural competence and an increased understanding of different cultures, which is something that we value in America and something that we want. Cultural competence is important in easing the disparities in the American healthcare system, for example. There are a lot of disparities in the American healthcare system, and a lot of times this sort of cultural boundaries present some issues for certain individuals to seek health in America, to seek healthcare in America, excuse me. So if we can increase our cultural competence in this understanding of different cultures, how they get sick, why they're getting sick, what would urge a specific individual from a specific culture to seek help, understanding the language, reducing language barriers. All of this is cultural competence that contributes to decreasing these disparities that we see in the current healthcare system. So cultural diffusion and cultural competence are really important to understand, and they're just important for health in general. So cultural transmission refers to the process of spreading cultural information across generations. So from parents to children, for example. And I think one of the most obvious examples of this are the school systems. They play a very large role in the transmission of cultural information to the younger generation. Okay. So cultural lag occurs when material culture changes faster than non-material culture. This is often a result of technological advances, and we see it in a bunch of different places. We see it on social media. There are just constantly new platforms that are rising, and there are a lot of ethical and moral questions that arise as well. And one of the examples in medicine is the rise of genetic engineering. So the technology of genetic engineering would be considered material culture for whichever culture has discovered it. So I guess globally at this point, genetic engineering has progressed much more quickly than society's acceptance of it. So there are ongoing moral and ethical debates about the use of genetic engineering, what its limits are, what we should use it for, what we shouldn't use it for. So we have this material culture, this actual technology that's developed, but we're not really sure how we're supposed to use it. And we haven't really come to a consensus about that. So that's what cultural lag is. It's when the material aspect of something is ahead of the non-material development of that same thing. And that causes, it causes some friction in society. It causes debate, disagreement. Another interesting aspect, so when an individual experiences disorientation as a result of being subjected to alternative cultures, and this is often through travel or relocation, they are said to be experiencing culture shock. So this disorientation may be extremely challenging for an individual trying to acclimate to these new changes. So you could think of someone maybe moving to a new country, or even maybe say a high school student who just graduated and is moving very, very far away to a completely different region of their country, or maybe even a different country. They're going to be on their own for the first time. They have to cook, clean, go out, get food. And on top of all of that, if they're moving to some place that's really geographically separated from, from their own original location, the food is going to be different. The people are going to be different. The way they speak is different. their attitudes towards different things might be different. So sometimes that all of that conglomerate of different culture basically is what contributes to this feeling of culture shock, which is just that disorientation. And it could be very disheartening sometimes, and it could be very hard to adapt to the new culture. And interestingly, once an individual is accustomed to this new environment, they may experience what is called reverse culture shock when they return home. So that's basically the exact same thing, obviously in reverse. Once you get acclimated to that new environment and you go back to your own place, you return to your own home location, you may experience reverse culture shock because now you're so used to where you're living now. Okay. So more cultural interactions. So when those from different cultures mix with each other, there are many different outcomes. And we're going to discuss three of them, the three major ones that are on the MCAT. So make sure you know these three. You should definitely know them by name and definition. So assimilation is the one that we've heard of the most. It's probably the most mainstream. It is the process by which an individual forsakes aspects of his or her current culture to adopt those of a different culture. And assimilation was had a much more positive connotation maybe in the 19th and 20th century. But now in the 21st century, we're sort of valuing multiculturalism a lot more, basically because of that cultural competence that we were talking about a few minutes ago. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a good thing to introduce elements of different cultures, because diversity is what gives us, a different outlook on maybe a situation that we've been looking at one way for years and years. We have new ways to look at it. So someone moving to a new country may give up the dressings of his or her old culture and adopt a style more in line with the new culture. So maybe someone who is moving from a sub-Saharan African country moves to America. If they change their traditional clothing and they adopt a more Western style, that would be considered, assimilation. So another is amalgamation, and that occurs when two cultures blend with each other to create a new culture different from any of the original cultures. And there are a lot of examples of amalgamation in America, especially down south. If you go to like the Cajun areas or Tex-Mex areas down there, it's like American and Mexican cuisines have been, and even aspects of French cuisine. It's like fusion. We use the word fusion in our day-to-day lives. That's what amalgamation really is. It's these cultures that are blending together to create a new culture, new aspects, new elements that were different from the original cultures. Yeah, so that's a pretty interesting one too. And then we have multiculturalism or pluralism, and that occurs when multiple cultures exist side by side in a society. And I did mention that a little while ago. It's existing side by side, but not blending too much. So for example, if you're in New York, you go to Manhattan or you go to Queens and you walk down a block, you'll see a pizzeria, a Thai food place, a Mexican place, pretty much anything you can think of, all on the same block. Any type of food you could think of is all going to be on the same block. And that's a really good example of multiculturalism. It's multiple cultures existing side by side. Okay, so review time. You can pause the video. You can take a minute if you want to read this over. You can pause the video because I will show you guys the answer in about 5 seconds. So which of the following is not an example of material culture? Okay, so which of the following is not an example of material culture? The answer is B, singing. So again, remember, material culture is just physical. So clothing is definitely an example of material culture. What we wear is a huge indicator of where we're from. C, housing structures, the types of houses that we live in, the types of shelters that we live in is also an example of material culture. A housing structure in America is going to be very different from, say, some sort of housing structure in Tibet, for example. And cell phones as well. Cell phones vary. Some countries may have lower rates of cell phone ownership, some may have higher rates. The types of cell phones, the models, what they do, they're all going to vary from culture to culture. So as you travel, you can actually physically see the change in culture. And that's really the indicator of material culture. So the only one that is not material is singing, B, because it's not physical. It would be an art, it would be part of non-material culture.